The old sat alone at the center of the great hall. His scales had faded from the deep purple of youth to a pale gray that spoke of many years and many sorrows. His name was, and he had come to tell his story to the historians who watched him from their seats above. The archive hall of Prime was neutral ground. 12 species had sent their scholars to hear testimony about the wars that had shaped the galaxy. Today, they wanted to hear about the human war. They wanted to know what had happened on those burning worlds where the Dominion had met its match. Looked up at the faces watching him. Some were curious, some were skeptical. A few seemed almost eager, as if they expected entertainment. He would give them none of that. He would give them truth, and the truth was not entertaining. The truth was horror. He began to speak in his rasping voice. He told them that 30 years had passed since the war ended, but he still dreamed of it. He still woke in the night with the smell of smoke in his nostrils and the sound of human screams in his ears. He told them he was one of the few who had fought on the ground against humans and lived to grow old. Most of his comrades had not been so fortunate. The Dominion had been proud in those days, he explained. They had conquered 17 species across 300 years. They had built an empire on the bones of those who resisted and the labor of those who surrendered. When their scouts discovered humanity, a young species that had only recently spread beyond their home world, the High Command saw opportunity. They saw resources. They saw another easy conquest. Had been a junior officer then, barely past his training years. He served aboard the assault carrier called Blade of Conquest, one of 40 great ships that entered human space in the first wave. He remembered standing on the observation deck as they approached the Sol system. He remembered the excitement among the crew. They spoke of glory and promotion and the honors they would earn. The human fleet that rose to meet them was small and outdated. Their ships were slower and their weapons were weaker. The battle lasted only hours before the human defenders were scattered. The path to conquest lay open, and the fleet pushed forward to claim its prize. Was assigned to the ground forces that landed on a human colony world called New Haven. It was a green and pleasant planet, much like in its younger days. The humans had built cities and farms across its surface. They had made it their home. They intended to take that home from them. The landing went smoothly. Commanded a reconnaissance unit of 20 soldiers. Their task was to scout ahead of the main force and identify enemy positions. On the first day, they encountered little resistance. A few scattered shots from distant tree lines. A few abandoned vehicles on empty roads. The humans seemed to be retreating, falling back toward their cities. The officers spoke confidently of swift victory. They compared this campaign to previous conquests where the native species had surrendered within weeks. Some even complained that there would not be enough fighting to earn proper glory. Shared their confidence. He had been trained to believe in superiority, and nothing he had seen gave him reason to doubt. Then came the first night on New Haven. His unit made camp in a small valley near a river. They posted guards and settled in to rest. The night was quiet except for the strange sounds of alien insects and the wind moving through unfamiliar trees. Slept lightly, as soldiers do in enemy territory. He woke to screaming. The attack came from everywhere and nowhere. Explosions ripped through the camp. Gunfire crackled from the darkness. Grabbed his weapon and scrambled for cover, but he could not see the enemy. He could only see his fellow soldiers falling around him. He could only hear their cries of pain and confusion. The attack lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Then the humans vanished back into the night as quickly as they had come. When dawn arrived, counted the dead. 8 of his 20 soldiers lay scattered across the ruined camp. They had been killed by an enemy they never saw. This was not how war was supposed to work. The way of war was honorable and direct. Armies met armies on open ground. The stronger force won and the weaker force surrendered or died. But the humans did not follow these rules. They struck from shadows. They killed without showing themselves. They refused to stand and fight like proper warriors. In the days that followed, learned that his experience was not unique. All across New Haven, units were being ambushed and harassed. Supply convoys were destroyed by bombs hidden in the roads. Patrols disappeared into the forests and were never seen again. The humans were not retreating. They were spreading out, surrounding the invaders, turning every hill and valley into a killing ground. Paused his testimony and looked at the historians above him. He saw that their expressions had changed. The skepticism was fading. The eagerness was gone. They were beginning to understand. He told them that he had asked himself many times what made humans so terrifying. It was not their weapons, which were crude by standards. It was not their numbers, which were far smaller than the invasion force. It was not even their tactics, which other species had tried before without success. It was something else, something in their spirit that they had never encountered. The humans refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. They refused to surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice. They fought on when fighting was hopeless, and they made the pay for every step forward in blood. Had seen many strange and terrible things in his long life. He had watched stars die and worlds burn, but nothing had frightened him like those first weeks on New Haven, when he learned that they had finally met an enemy they could not break. The historian sat in silence, waiting for him to continue. He took a breath and gathered his thoughts. The testimony had only begun. There was so much more to tell, and none of it was easy, but they needed to hear it. The galaxy needed to understand what humanity was capable of when pushed to war. He closed his eyes for a moment, and he was back on New Haven, young and afraid, watching the smoke rise from another burning convoy. He opened his eyes and continued his story. Continued his testimony as the historians listened in silence. He told them about the weeks that followed that first terrible night. He told them how the army pushed deeper into New Haven and how every mile of progress cost them dearly. His unit had been reinforced after the ambush, brought back up to strength with fresh soldiers from the fleet. Their new orders sent them toward the planetary capital, a city called Port Collins. The main army would follow once the scouts cleared the way. It should have been simple work. It was anything but simple. The road to Port Collins wound through farmland and forest. The humans had abandoned their fields, but they had not abandoned their fight. Every bridge was rigged with explosives. Every crossroads held the possibility of ambush. They learned to move slowly, to check every shadow, to trust nothing. Told the historians about a human named Danny Cole. He was a farmer who had worked this land before the invasion. Now he led a resistance cell that operated in the hills above the main road. Cole and his fighters had no military training and few proper weapons. They built their bombs from fertilizer and fuel. They made their plans in barns and basements, and they killed soldiers with terrible efficiency. 3 supply convoys were destroyed in a single week. Each time, the explosions came without warning. Each time, the attackers disappeared before they could respond. The soldiers began to fear the roads. They began to see enemies in every farmer and every farmhouse. Trust became impossible when anyone might be waiting with a hidden bomb. This unit was ordered to search a small town along their route. The humans there had not fled. They stood in their doorways and watched the soldiers with cold eyes. They did not fight, but they did not help either. They answered questions with silence or lies. They hid their young men and claimed ignorance of the resistance. The commander ordered arrests. They took prisoners from every house, hopping to find information about the attacks. Among those captured was a schoolteacher named. She was a small woman with gray in her hair and steel in her eyes. The interrogators worked on her for hours, but she told them nothing. She did not beg. She did not weep. She simply looked at her captors with contempt and kept her silence. Watched the interrogation through a window. He had seen prisoners break before. He had seen them trade information for mercy, but was different. She seemed to draw strength from her suffering, as if every blow only made her more determined. In the end, the interrogators gave up. They had learned nothing, and they had revealed much about their own frustration. They were disturbed to discover that humans of all ages participated in the resistance. Old men carried messages between cells. Teenagers scouted positions and reported back to their elders. Children as young as 10 served as lookouts, watching the roads and whistling warnings when patrols approached. The entire population had become an enemy army without uniforms or ranks. Told the historians about a soldier named Park. He was captured after a firefight in the forest, badly wounded but still alive. The medics offered to treat his injuries. They were not cruel by nature, and their orders allowed for the care of prisoners. But Park refused. He pushed away their hands and spat curses at them. He chose to bleed out on the cold ground rather than accept help from his enemies. The soldiers stood around him and watched him die. None of them understood. Their own wounded would have accepted treatment from any source. Survival was the first instinct of every living thing. But this human had rejected survival itself rather than owe anything to those who had invaded his world. Remembered the silence after Park stopped breathing. He remembered the looks on his soldiers' faces. Something had changed in that moment. They had begun to realize that they were not fighting ordinary enemies. They were fighting something they had never encountered in all their conquests. The nights were the worst, told the historians how the darkness belonged to the humans. They moved through the forests like ghosts. They knew every path and every hiding place. They posted double guards and kept their weapons ready, but it was never enough. One night, a human raiding party struck the camp where units slept. They came in silence, killing the guards before they could raise an alarm. By the time the soldiers woke to the sound of gunfire, half of them were already dead. The attackers vanished into the trees before reinforcements could arrive. They left behind only bodies and fear. Survived that night by luck alone. A falling beam had knocked him unconscious at the start of the attack. The humans had passed him by, thinking him dead. He woke at dawn, surrounded by the corpses of soldiers he had known and led. He was 23 years old, and he had already seen more death than most saw in a lifetime. He told the historians that they had conquered 17 species before humanity. He had studied those conquests in his training. He knew how each species had fought and how each had fallen. Some had resisted bravely but briefly. Others had surrendered quickly to spare themselves suffering. A few had fought well enough to earn respect before their inevitable defeat. None of them had fought like this. None of them had made the afraid to close their eyes at night. None of them had turned every shadow into a threat and every civilian into a potential killer. The humans were different, and that difference was beginning to cost them dearly. Paused again in his testimony. He looked at the historians and saw that they were leaning forward in their seats. They wanted to know more. They wanted to understand how a young and primitive species had become such fearsome enemies. He told them the truth. He told them that humans were not stronger than they were not smarter or more advanced, but they had something they lacked. They had a fury that burned without end. They had a stubbornness that refused to bend. They had decided that their world was worth any price, and they were willing to pay that price in blood and years and lives. The historians wrote their notes and waited for him to continue. There was more to tell. Port Collins still waited ahead, and the worst was yet to come. The army reached Port Collins after 6 weeks of bloody progress, stood on a hill overlooking the city, and felt something he had never expected to feel. He felt dread. Port Collins spread across the valley below like a gray stone forest. Tall buildings rose toward the sky. Bridges crossed the river that divided the city in two. Somewhere in those streets, hundreds of thousands of humans waited. The high command expected them to surrender. The city was surrounded. Escape was impossible. Logic demanded submission. But the humans had stopped following logic long ago. Told the historians about the broadcast that came on the morning the siege began. A human voice crackled through every communication channel. The speaker identified herself as Colonel Bates Sanders, commander of the human forces defending the city. Her message was short and clear. She said that Port Collins would not surrender. She said that every building would be defended and every street would cost lives. She said that the invaders could burn the city to ashes and the defenders would fight from the ashes. She welcomed them to try their strength against humans who had nothing left to lose. The commanders laughed at the broadcast. They had overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. They controlled the skies and the space above. What could one city do against such power? They gave the order to advance, confident that the siege would last only days. The siege lasted 4 months. This unit was among the first to enter the outer districts. They moved carefully through empty streets, weapons ready, eyes watching every window. The first shots came from a building on their left. 2 soldiers fell before anyone could react. The returned fire, pouring rounds into the structure until its walls crumbled. When they searched the rubble, they found 1 dead human with an ancient rifle and 300 empty shells. 1 human had held them for an hour. 1 human had killed 2 soldiers and wounded 3 more. 1 human had turned a single building into a fortress, and there were thousands more buildings ahead. The days that followed taught what urban warfare truly meant. The humans fought from apartments and offices. They fought from rooftops and basements. They dug tunnels through the sewers and moved unseen beneath the streets. They collapsed buildings onto advancing troops and flooded tunnels to drown those who followed. Every block became a battlefield. Every corner held death. Made a friend during those terrible months. His name was a fellow officer who commanded a unit in the same sector. They shared meals when they could and spoke quietly in the rare moments of peace. Was older and wiser, a veteran of 3 previous conquests. He had seen resistance before. He had never seen anything like this. Told that something was wrong with this war. He said they were not conquering Port Collins. They were being consumed by it. Every day brought more casualties. Every victory cost more than it gained. The humans lost 10 fighters for every soldier they killed, but they kept fighting anyway. They seemed to have an endless supply of courage and fury. Told the historians about a human medic named Chris Young. He was captured during a raid on a makeshift hospital hidden in a basement. They found him treating wounded civilians, mostly children and elderly who had been caught in the crossfire. When the soldiers dragged him away, he did not resist. He asked only one thing. He asked to be allowed to finish bandaging a child's burned arm before his execution. The officer in charge could have refused. Chris Young was an enemy and enemies deserved no kindness. But something in the medic's calm voice gave him pause. He allowed Chris Young to finish his work. The medic wrapped the child's wounds with steady hands, spoke soft words of comfort, and then stood to face his captors. He thanked them for the delay. He did not beg for his life. Never learned what happened to Chris Young. Prisoners were taken to camps in the rear, and their fates were not discussed. But he remembered the medic's face. He remembered the quiet dignity of a man who cared more about a wounded child than his own survival. He remembered and wondered what kind of species could produce such people. The High Command grew impatient as the siege dragged on. They wanted Port Collins conquered. They wanted this stubborn city broken. When ground assaults failed to make progress, they ordered orbital bombardment of civilian sectors. Ships in orbit rained fire on residential districts where no military targets existed. Thousands of humans died in the flames. Watched entire neighborhoods burn. He heard the screams even from miles away. He saw the smoke rise into the sky and blot out the sun. He expected the surviving humans to finally surrender, to accept that resistance was hopeless against such power. They did not surrender. They fought from the ruins. They emerged from the rubble with blackened faces and burning eyes, and they kept killing soldiers. The bombardment had not broken them. It had only made them angrier. Was killed on the 87th day of the siege. A sniper's bullet found him while he inspected a forward position. He died in his arms, bleeding out on the broken stones of a human street. His last words stayed with forever. said they were not conquering these people. He said they were only proving that these people could not be conquered. Then he closed his eyes and was gone. Buried his friend in a garden behind a ruined school. He marked the grave with a piece of metal from a destroyed vehicle. He did not pray because they did not pray, but he stood in silence for a long time, thinking about what it said. The city fell eventually. The historians knew this already because history recorded the outcome, but told them the truth that history often forgot. They did not win at Port Collins. They simply ran out of enemies to kill in that place. The humans who survived melted away into the countryside and joined other resistance cells. The fight continued elsewhere as it always did. Looked at the historians and saw sorrow in some of their eyes. Others still watched with cold academic interest. They wanted facts and figures. They wanted to understand the war as a series of events. They did not want to understand it as he understood it, as an endless nightmare that still haunted his sleep 30 years later. He continued anyway. The story was not finished. The worst was yet to come. 2 years had passed since the invasion began. Was no longer a junior officer. He had been promoted many times, not because of his skill, but because so many above him had died. Now he commanded occupation forces across a large sector of New Haven. He had soldiers and vehicles and authority. He had everything except hope. The war had changed in those 2 years. They still held the cities they had captured, but holding them required constant effort. Resistance cells operated in every district. Bombs exploded on random streets. Soldiers were killed in their beds by servants and workers who had seemed loyal for months. Trust was impossible. Peace was a dream. Told the historians that they had won every major battle. They had crushed human armies in open combat. They had taken city after city. By every measure that mattered to military planners, they were winning. But the planners did not understand what was happening on the ground. They did not see the fear in their soldiers' eyes or hear the despair in their voices. They did not know that victory had become meaningless. Human reinforcements arrived from Earth in the second year of the war. The fleet was not large enough to challenge control of space, but it was enough to contest it. Supply lines became uncertain. Reinforcements became rare. The occupation force that had seemed so mighty began to feel alone and abandoned. On the ground, the resistance never stopped. A new generation of fighters had emerged during the occupation. They were young people who had grown up under rule, who had known nothing but war since childhood. They were harder and fiercer than the fighters who came before. They had no memory of peace to make them hesitate. They had only hatred, and hatred made them fearless. Met one of these young fighters in the third year of the war. His name was Sam, and he was barely 17 years old. He had been captured after a bombing that killed a dozen soldiers. The explosive had been hidden in a delivery cart, and Sam had pushed that cart into the middle of a patrol before running for cover. The soldiers wanted to execute Sam immediately. Bombers were shown no mercy under military law, but ordered them to wait. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know what made a boy so young willing to kill and die for a war he could not remember starting. He visited Sam in the holding cell. The boy sat against the wall with his hands bound, but his eyes were not afraid. They burned with a cold fire that had seen too many times before. It was the fire of someone who had already accepted death and found freedom in that acceptance. Asked Sam why he fought. The boy laughed at the question. He said he fought because they were on his world. He said he fought because they had killed his parents and his sister and everyone he had ever loved. He said he would keep fighting until he was dead or until every soldier was gone from New Haven. There was no other option. There was no compromise possible. Asked if Sam hated him personally. The boy considered the question seriously. He said he did not know well enough to hate him personally, but he hated what represented. He hated the uniform and the flag and everything they stood for. He hated with every breath he took, and that hatred would not end until one side or the other was destroyed. Left the cell and did not sleep that night. He thought about Sam and the thousands of young humans like him. He thought about what the war had created. They had not come to New Haven to make enemies. They had come for resources and territory, for the practical needs of an expanding empire. Instead, they had planted seeds of hatred that would grow for generations. The war turned against them in the third year. Human forces launched a massive offensive that caught the occupation by surprise. 3 major cities fell in a single week. Defensive lines collapsed as soldiers retreated in disorder. The humans pressed forward with a fury that swept away everything in its path. Received orders from the High Command as his sector came under attack. The orders were simple and terrible. All human prisoners were to be executed before retreat. They would leave nothing useful behind. They would leave only corpses and ashes. Read the orders twice to make sure he understood. Then he walked to the prison where Sam and 40 other humans waited in their cells. His soldiers followed him, waiting for the command to carry out the executions. He stood outside the cells and looked at the prisoners. They looked back at him with eyes that expected death. Some were young like Sam. Others were old, veterans of 3 years of resistance. A few were wounded, bandages wrapped around injuries they had earned fighting for their world. None of them begged. None of them wept. They had made their peace with what was coming. He thought about the words his friend had spoken before dying. He thought about Chris Young and Park. He thought about all the humans he had seen refuse to break, refuse to bend, refuse to accept anything less than freedom or death. He gave an order, but it was not the order his superiors expected. He told his soldiers to open the cells. He told them to release the prisoners and let them go. The soldiers stared at him in confusion. Some protested. One even raised his weapon as if to stop the betrayal, met his eyes and repeated the order in a voice that allowed no argument. The cells were opened. The prisoners walked out slowly, not quite believing what was happening. Sam stopped in front of and studied his face for a long moment. The boy did not thank him. He did not smile or offer any gesture of gratitude. He simply nodded once and walked away into the night with the others. Watched them go. He knew what he had done. He had disobeyed a direct order in wartime. He had betrayed his oath and his people. He would face punishment if he survived, possibly execution. He did not care. He could not add more innocent blood to the ocean that already stained his hands. He told the historians that moment was when he finally understood the truth. They could kill humans by the millions, and there would still be more waiting. They could burn cities and slaughter populations, and the survivors would remember. The hatred would pass from parent to child for 1,000 years. They could not win a war against memory and hatred. They could only drown in it. The retreat from New Haven cost the 30,000 soldiers, survived by chance and reached a transport that carried him off the planet. He looked down at the green world as the ship rose through the atmosphere. Somewhere below, Sam and the others were rejoining the resistance. Somewhere below, the war continued. Knew then that they had lost. They simply had not admitted it yet. The Dominion sued for peace in the 4th year of the war. They had lost 60% of their invasion force. Their economy was crumbling under the strain of endless conflict. Their citizens were asking questions that had never been asked before. Why were their children dying for distant worlds? What had the humans ever done to threaten the Dominion? Was this war worth the price? Told the historians that the peace terms were harsh but not genocidal. The humans demanded reparations that would take decades to pay. They demanded the dismantling of military bases near their space. They demanded trials for war crimes committed during the occupation. They did not demand the destruction of the people. They wanted justice, not revenge. Some in the Dominion called the humans weak for not pressing their advantage. They said a truly strong species would have pursued the Tether and made them suffer as they had suffered, but understood what the humans were doing. They were showing the galaxy that they could be merciful even to those who had wronged them. They were proving that their fury could be controlled, that it was a weapon they used rather than a madness that used them. The war crimes tribunals began a year after the peace treaty was signed. Officers and soldiers were brought before human judges to answer for their actions during the occupation. The galaxy watched as testimony was given and evidence was presented. The galaxy learned what had been done on New Haven and the other occupied worlds. Was called to testify. He could have refused. He could have hidden behind military loyalty and claimed ignorance of what his commanders had ordered. Many others chose that path. They protected their own and said nothing that might help the human prosecutors. But had seen too much. He had carried his guilt for too long. He stood before the tribunal and told the truth. He described the massacres he had witnessed. He named the officers who had ordered civilian executions. He provided details that helped convict a dozen high-ranking commanders. His own people called him a traitor. His family disowned him. Old comrades spat at the mention of his name. He was exiled from space and forbidden to return. He had given everything for his testimony, and he regretted nothing. The truth had needed to be told. The dead had deserved that much. Years passed, wandered the galaxy, finding work where he could, living quietly in the margins of society. He grew old alone, surrounded by species who viewed him with suspicion because of his heritage. He accepted their distrust as his due. He had been part of something terrible, and no amount of testimony could wash that stain completely clean. 20 years after the war ended, a reconciliation delegation was formed. Diplomats and civilians traveled to human space to begin the long process of healing. Was invited to join them, not as a representative of the dominion that had exiled him, but as a witness who had shown that not all were monsters. He returned to New Haven for the first time since the retreat. The planet had changed. The scars of war were still visible in some places, but new buildings had risen where the old ones had burned. Forests had over battlefields. Children played in parks that had once been killing grounds. Life had continued as it always did. The delegation visited Port Collins. The city had been rebuilt almost entirely. Only a few ruins remained, preserved as memorials to those who had died in the siege. Walked through streets he remembered from nightmares and found them transformed into something peaceful and ordinary. He visited a memorial wall near the city center. It was made of black stone, and it stretched for hundreds of meters. Names were carved into its surface, thousands upon thousands of names. These were the humans who had died defending Port Collins. These were the people who had refused to surrender, who had made the pay for every block in blood. Stood before the wall for a long time. He did not recognize any of the names. They were just letters carved in stone. But he knew what each name represented. He knew that every one of them had been a person with hopes and fears, with family and friends, with a life that had been cut short by a war they had not chosen. A voice spoke behind him, turned and found himself facing a human man about his own age. The man studied him with eyes that seemed familiar and realized with a shock who he was. Sam had grown old. His hair had gone gray and lines marked his face. But his eyes were the same eyes that had burned with hatred in a prison cell 30 years before. He was dressed in civilian clothes now, and a badge on his chest identified him as a member of the Port Collins City Council. The teenage bomber had become a builder and a leader. Sam said he had heard that was part of the delegation. He said he had wanted to see for himself the officer who had released him and 40 others when the executions were ordered. He had wanted to understand why. Told him the truth. He said he had released them because he could not add more murder to his conscience. He said he had done it for himself as much as for them. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deserve forgiveness. Sam was silent for a moment. Then he said something that had not expected. He said he would not offer forgiveness because forgiveness was not his to give. The dead could not forgive. But he offered acknowledgement. He acknowledged that had made a choice that saved lives. He acknowledged that one at least had found his limits. They stood together before the memorial wall, the old soldier and the former resistance fighter. They did not shake hands. They did not embrace. They simply shared a moment of silence for the dead and the lost and the broken. Then Sam nodded once, just as he had done 30 years before, and walked away. Finished his testimony in the archive hall as the historians watched. He told them he had come to share what he had witnessed so that future generations might learn from it. He told them the galaxy needed to understand what humanity was capable of when pushed to war. He said humans were not gods or demons. They were ordinary creatures of flesh and blood who could be killed as easily as any other species. But they had something inside them that made them terrible enemies. They had a fire that would not die. They had a stubbornness that refused all compromise. They had decided long ago that freedom was worth any price, and they had proven that belief on battlefields across the stars. Looked at the historians from the 12 species and spoke his final words. He told them that if they took anything from his testimony, they should take this warning. Humans do not forget. They do not surrender. And they do not stop. There was hell because the humans made it hell, and they were willing to live in that hell longer than the were. That is why they won. That is why they will always win. He rose from his seat and walked slowly out of the archive hall. The historians sat in silence behind him, their notes filled with facts and figures that could never capture the full truth of what he had told them. Outside, the sun was setting over Prime, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of fire. Was tired. He had carried his story for 30 years, and now he had finally set it down. Whatever happened next was not his concern. He had done what he came to do. He had told the truth about the human. He walked into the fading light and did not look back.